If you want to learn everything about the critical path method, this is the video for you. First, we will cover the key terminologies that you need to master. Then, we will draw a network diagram together and show you a trick to make the drawing easier. Finally, we will calculate the critical path using two popular approaches, the +-1 method and zero-day method. Or you can use the video timeline and skip to the most relevant section. By the end of the video, you will have a solid understanding of the critical path method. If this sounds good to you, let's get started with the terminologies. First, what is a network diagram? A network diagram is a visual representation of project activities and their dependencies. It helps project managers identify task sequences, overlaps, and potential delays. Precedence diagramming method is the most commonly used method for drawing the network diagram. The activities are represented as nodes or boxes, and arrows show their dependencies. We will go over drawing a network diagram together shortly. Next, let's go over the 4 types of dependencies. Dependencies define how tasks relate to each other. Finish to start, FS. This is the most common dependency, which means task 1 has to finish before task 2 can start. For example, the student needs to finish and hand in the exam before the teacher can start grading it. Another example is that the workers have to finish building the wall before the wall can be painted. Next, start to start, SS. This means task 2 cannot start until task 1 starts, but doesn't have to wait until task 1 finishes. For example, in a classroom, the professor has to begin the lecture before students can start taking notes. Another example is that writing code has to start before starting code review. Next, finish to finish, FF. In this dependency, task 2 cannot finish until task 1 finishes. For example, a professor is grading final exams and preparing students' report cards. The professor has to finish grading the final exams for all students before finishing all the students' report cards. Here is another example. Let's say a company is assembling and inspecting electronic devices before shipment. In this case, all the assembly has to be finished before the quality inspection can be completed. Finally, start to finish, SF. This is the least common dependency. In this dependency, task 2 cannot finish until task 1 starts. For example, a university is transitioning from an old library book checkout system to a new digital system. In this case, the new digital system has to start functioning before shutting down and finishing the old system. Another example is at a 24/7 security desk. The night security guard has to arrive and start his shift before the morning security guard finishes shift. Next, let's talk about the critical path method. The critical path is the longest sequence of dependent activities that must be finished on time to complete the project. This path represents the shortest amount of time needed to finish the work. Tasks on this path have 0 floats, meaning any delay on tasks in the critical path will impact the project's end date. A time box is used to represent an activity. At the center is the name of the activity. On the top are the early start, duration, and early finish of the activity. At the bottom are the late start, total float, and late finish of the activity. The start and finish represent how early or late the activity can start and finish. Those dates are determined using the forward and backward path, which we will cover later in the video. The duration is how long the activity takes to complete. Next, let's talk about float. Float, also known as slack, is a general term referring to the time a task can be delayed without affecting the project schedule. There are 2 types of floats. Total float is the maximum amount of time a task can be delayed without impacting the overall project completion date. This is the float represented in the time box. The formula to calculate total float is total float equals late start, LS minus early start, ES. Or you can also calculate using total float equals late finish, LF minus early finish, EF. Next, let's talk about free float. Free float is the delay allowed before it affects the next dependent task. The formula for calculating free float is free float equals the earliest start of the next task minus the earliest finish of the current task. Again, the key difference is that total float impacts the project end date, whereas the free float impacts the next dependent task. Float is essential for scheduling flexibility and helps project managers manage resources efficiently. While the total float and free float for an activity are usually the same, they can be different, which I will illustrate as we go through a critical path example later in the video. Before we wrap up this section, another two terminologies that you will hear often are the lead and lag. Let's quickly cover them as they are quite simple to understand. Lead allows the successor or next activity to start before the predecessor is fully complete. For example, software testing starts 2 days before development is fully finished. This is a finish to start relationship with a 2-day lead, represented by using FS minus 2 days. Lead can offer useful insights if the project manager needs to fast-track the project and compress the schedule. Next, lag is a delay between the finish of one activity and the start of the next activity. For example, concrete pouring is completed, but a 3-day lag is required for it to dry before construction can continue. This is also a finish to start relationship, but with 3-day lag, represented using FS plus 3 days. Okay, that wraps up the terminology section. We can now get into the fun part of creating a network diagram using the precedence diagramming method. Typically, the question will provide a table of activities with predecessors and durations. Here is a little trick that will make it easier to draw the network diagram. For most people, going from start to finish is easier and comes more naturally. So instead of reading from column 1 to column 2, you may find it easier to read column 2 and then column 1 going from the predecessor to successor. Let's give it a try. A has no predecessor, so let's write A. A is the predecessor of B and C, so let's draw arrows from A to B and C. Then B goes to D. C goes to both E and F. D and E both go to G. F and G go to H. There you go. We just completed the network diagram. Is that easier? You can also pause the video here and try the traditional approach, going from column 1 to column 2 to determine which approach comes more naturally. If all you have to do is to figure out the critical path, and you have a simple network diagram, you can figure it out by adding the durations on the path. The path with the longest duration is the critical path. I am going to write the duration on the network diagram we just created. Let's calculate the duration of each path. We have 3 paths. The duration for the path ABDGH equals 3 plus 4 plus 8 plus 1 plus 2 equals 18. The duration for the path ACEGH equals 3 plus 5 plus 5 plus 1 plus 2 equals 16. The duration for the path ACFH equals 3 plus 5 plus 4 plus 2 equals 14. In our diagram, ABDGH has the longest duration and therefore it is the critical path. In other words, this project will need at least 18 days to complete without any delays. Let's move on to our next section. Determine the critical path using the time box and float. There are 2 popular methods, and we will go over both methods and discuss which is better suited given your situation. For lack of better names, I will call the first approach the plus-minus-1 method, and the second approach the 0-day method. The plus-minus-1 critical path method is more complicated. This is the method commonly taught in the academic environment, including the Project Management Institute. This approach offers a better view of the dates when a task finishes and the next task starts. Use this method if you have to show your work and the exact start and end dates are important. To save time, let me draw the network diagram again with durations and activities in the time box. What confuses many students is why we need to plus and minus 1 when counting the days. Instead of trying to remember the formula, let's think logically, and it will start to make sense. To make this visual and easy, we are going back to our elementary school days and using our hands to count the days. Let's take a look at Activity A. Activity A takes 3 days to finish. So we are going to start working on day 1, continue on day 2, and finish the work at the end of day 3. Therefore, we write down day 1 as the early start and day 3 as the early finish. Since it's already the end of day on day 3, the next activities B and C will start on day 4. To get the early finish for activity A by doing the math will be 1 early start plus 3 duration minus 1 equals 3. Let's do activity B next. Activity B will start on day 4 and take 4 days to finish, so it will take day 4, 5, 6, and 7 to finish the work, so the early finish is 7. And the next activity begins on day 8. Once you understand how the days are accounted for, the math will make a lot of sense. We are going to move a bit more quickly by doing math from this point for the forward path. The early finish for activity D is 8 plus 8 minus 1 equals 15. Before we can determine the dates for activity G, we will need to know the early finish for activity E2, so we need to go back and work on activity C. For activity C, the early finish is 4 plus 5 minus 1 equals 8. The next activities E and F will start on day 9. The early finish for activity E is equal to 9 plus 5 minus 1 equals 13. The early finish for activity F is equal to 9 plus 4 minus 1 equals 12. Now we can come back to activity G. Since both activities D and E have to finish before working on activity G, we must pick the latest early finish date, which is 15 from activity D. So, activity G will start on day 16. Since activity G only takes 1 day to finish, it will finish at the end of the day on day 16. Activity H will start on day 17 by following the same logic, from taking the early finish from activity G and adding 1. The early finish for activity H is equal to 17 plus 2 minus 1 equals 18. Now that we have completed the forward path, we will work on the backward path from activity H. First, the late finish is 18, which is carried over from the early finish. Activity H takes 2 days to finish, so we need to count backward, and it will take day 18 and day 17 to do the work. So the late start is 17, or you can do the math by 18 minus 2 plus 1 equals 17. This means the late finish for activities G and F will be day 16. Activity G only takes 1 day to finish, so we are still in day 16 for the late start. Or you can do the math, late start is equal to 16 minus 1 plus 1, which is 16. For activity F, the late start is 16 minus 4 plus 1 equals 13. Activity E has 15 as the late finish. The late start is 15 minus 5 plus 1 equals 11. Activity D also has 15 as the late finish. The late start is 15 minus 8 plus 1 equals 8. Let's think about what the late finish for activity C should be. Is it the smaller number 11 from activity E or the higher number 13 from activity F? In this case, we need to pick the smaller number going backward. So activity C has to finish on day 10 as the late finish, so that activity E can have a late start of 11. This means the late start for activity C is 10 minus 5 plus 1 equals 6. Activity B has 7 as the late finish. The late start is 7 minus 4 plus 1 equals 4. Finally, activity A will take the smaller late start from activity B, so the late finish is 3 for activity A. The late start is 3 minus 3 plus 1 equals 1. Now that we have completed the backward path, we can fill in the total float for each of the activities. If you remember, there are 2 ways to calculate the total float. You can get total float by either doing late start minus early start or late finish minus early finish. You should get the same result. If not, this means you didn't put in the dates correctly somewhere, and it is a good sanity check. So the total float for activity A is 1 minus 1 equals 0. The total float for activity B is 4 minus 4 equals 0. The total float for activity C is 6 minus 4 equals 2. The total float for activity D is 8 minus 8 equals 0. The total float for activity E is 11 minus 9 equals 2. The total float for activity F is 13 minus 9 equals 4. The total float for activity G is 16 minus 16 equals 0. The total float for activity H is 17 minus 17 equals 0. The critical path is the path that has zero total float, so that will be the path with activity A, B, D, G, H. Now, let's talk about free float. Remember, free float is the delay allowed before it affects the next dependent task. You calculate by taking the earliest start of the next activity minus the earliest finish of the current activity. Let's calculate the free float for activity A together. The earliest start of the next activities from B and C is 4, and the earliest finish of the current activity A is 3. Keep in mind that we also need to adjust the date by 1. Therefore, the free float for activity A is 4 minus 3 minus 1 equals 0. The free float for activity B is 8 minus 7 minus 1 equal to 0. The free float for activity C is 9 minus 8 minus 1 equal to 0. The free float for activity D is 16 minus 15 minus 1 equal to 0. The free float for activity E is 16 minus 13 minus 1 equal to 2. The free float for activity F is 17 minus 12 minus 1 equal to 4. The free float for activity G is 17 minus 16 minus 1 equal to 0. There is no activity after activity H, so activity H has no free float, or free float is effectively 0. You can see total float and free float are the same most of the time, except for activity C, where it has 2 for total float, but 0 for free float. If activity C is delayed by 1 day, it will impact the early start date for activity E and F, although the project completion date is not impacted. Here is another question. Let's go back and take a look at activity C and E, which both have 2 total floats. Does this mean we can slack off 2 days or 4 days in total without impacting the project timeline? If you want, pause the video here and think about it. Let's say activity C was delayed for 2 days, so the duration is 7 instead of 5. The early finish will change from 8 to 10, and the late start becomes 10 minus 7 minus 1 equal to 4. So activity C has 0 total float. Let's look at activity E. Now the early start will be 11 instead of 9, and the early finish becomes 11 plus 5 minus 1 equal to 15. You can see that activity E also has 0 float. As you can see, the path A, C, E, G, H only has room for 2 days to slack off, not 4. And now you have 2 critical paths. Activity F will also be impacted and cut the total float from 4 days to 2 days. This wraps up everything I want to cover for the plus-1 critical path method. Next, I will go over the 0-day method. This approach is easier because you do not need to plus or minus a day when calculating the start and end date using the forward and backward path. You can get the same result for the critical path and float values with less effort. Let's take a minute to fully understand how to count the dates using this approach so the math will come naturally and make sense. Remember, in the earlier plus-1 approach, we assumed all tasks finish at the end of the day and the next task starts in the next morning. However, what happens if the task usually finishes by noon and the next task usually begins in the afternoon of the same day? In this case, 0-day method may represent the dates better. To begin, let me draw the time box again with all the durations. Here is a timeline starting from 0. Using this approach, you count the days when you go from one day to the next. To keep it simple, let's assume that all activities finish at noon, and the next activity starts in the afternoon of the same day. Let's use activity A as an example. Activity A takes 3 days to finish. Activity A starts at noon on day 0, continues to noon on day 1, and this counts as 1 day of work. Between noon on day 1 and day 2 counts as the second day, and the noon between day 2 and day 3 counts as the third day. So activity A starts on day 0 and finishes on day 3 as the early finish. Using math, it is simply 0 plus 3 equals 3. At this point, you may wonder, do I have to start the timeline from day 0 or can I start from day 1? You can, but starting from day 0 has 2 benefits. First, it's easier and less confusing. Second, the dates for early finish and late finish for the activities will match those using the plus-1 approach. Let's get back and continue the forward path. Activities B and C will start from the tail end of day 3 as their early start. Activity B takes 4 days to finish, so it will start on day 3 and finish during day 7. To calculate the early finish for activity B is simply 3 plus 4 equals 7. As you can see, it's a simple math addition without plus and minus between activities. Let's move forward a bit more quickly. Early finish for activity C is 3 plus 5 equals 8. Early finish for activity D is 7 plus 8 equals 15. Early finish for activity E is 8 plus 5 equals 13. Early finish for activity F is 8 plus 4 equals 12. Activity G needs to take the higher early finish from activity D, so it is 15 plus 1 equals 16. Activity H needs to take the higher early finish from activity G, so it is 16 plus 2 equals 18. Doing the backward path is easy with simple subtraction, starting from activity H. First, let's carry over 18, the early finish, to late finish. The late start is 18 minus 2 equals 16. Then copy 16 to the late finish for activities G and F. The late start for activity G is 16 minus 1 equals 15. The late start for activity F is 16 minus 4 equals 12. The late start for activity E is 15 minus 5 equals 10. The late start for activity D is 15 minus 8 equals 7. For activity C, the late finish is the smaller value from activity E, which is 10. So the late start for activity C is 10 minus 5 equals 5. The late start for activity B is 7 minus 4 equals 3. For activity A, the late finish is the smaller value from activity B. So the late start for activity A is 3 minus 3 equals 0. Finally, let's fill in the total float for each activity. Again, you can calculate total float by doing late start minus early start, or late finish minus early finish. The total float for activity A is 0 minus 0 equals 0. Activity B is 3 minus 3 equals 0. Activity C is 5 minus 3 equals 2. Activity D is 7 minus 7 equals 0. Activity E is 10 minus 8 equals 2. Activity F is 12 minus 8 equals 4. Activity G is 15 minus 15 equals 0. Activity H is 16 minus 16 equals 0. To calculate the free float, you can simply take the earliest start of the next activity minus the earliest finish of the current activity without making minus 1 day adjustments. So the free float for activity A is 3 minus 3 equals 0. The free float for activity B is 7 minus 7 equals 0. Activity C is 8 minus 8 equals 0. Activity D is 15 minus 15 equals 0. Activity E is 15 minus 13 equals 2. Activity F is 16 minus 12 equals 4. Activity G is 16 minus 16 equals 0. Activity H has no free float or effectively 0, since this is the last activity. As you can see, you get the same result for total float and free float whether you use the plus minus 1 or 0 day critical path method. We went over the 0 day critical path method quickly since it's simpler, but feel free to pause, rewatch, or leave a comment if you have any questions. This wraps up our comprehensive coverage of the critical path method. We went over all the essential terminologies, drew a network diagram using the precedence diagramming method, and covered 2 popular approaches to the critical path method. Hopefully, this video gives you confidence and a clear understanding of the critical path method. If you found this video helpful in helping you understand the critical path method, please give a thumb up. Your support is greatly appreciated. Also, don't forget to subscribe for more project management insights. For even more resources, check out pmaspirant.com. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.